Sometimes the scariest thing about a horror movie is that it all really happened, even if only a part of a scary movie is true. It's usually enough to make you see the world in a totally different light.
When a scary movie has that based on a true story tagline, it automatically pricks the ears of any horror fan and unsettles them half to death. It doesn't matter how or when or why the real-life story took place, just that it did. That makes all the difference. It is because of this that SlashFilm truly hates to inform you that The Hills Have Eyes is one of those based on a true story horror films. Sorry to be the bearer of bad, scary news. While the 1977 film and Alexander Aja's 2006 remake share key story components and tone, the early aughts version upped the ante with one key difference. The remake's homicidal family is physically deformed due to secret nuclear tests on a mining town, carried out and covered up by the US government. Aja claimed in a behind-the-scenes featurette about the movie, "We based all our descriptions and directions on real documents, pictures, and footage that we found on the effects of nuclear fallout in Chernobyl and Hiroshima." While that aspect of the Hills Have Eyes remake is unquestionably rooted in reality, the writer-director of the original 1977 film, Wes Craven, opened up multiple times about the movie's sinister origins.
I went to the New York Public Library and went through their murder and mayhem division and ran across the story of the Shawnee Bean family.
According to legend, Alexander Sawney Bean was born in East Lothian, Scotland. Since his father worked as a hedge trimmer and ditch digger to raise him, Bean planned to follow in his footsteps. But Bean ended up living in a cave near the Galloway coast with Black Agnes Douglas, a woman with a taste for human flesh and carnage, a taste that Bean shared. The exact number of children and grandchildren the pair raised in the cave is unknown, but over the 25 years they called it home, it is believed they raised and cohabitated with nearly 50 family members. The clan, much like the families featured in the Hills Have Eyes films, would make meals out of clueless travelers who unfortunately came across their hunting grounds. The family allegedly murdered and ate upwards of 1,000 people without ever visiting any neighboring villages. But then, one of the victims successfully escaped the family. A man and his wife were attacked by the clan during a journey on horseback. Sadly, the wife did not survive, but her husband lived to tell the tale. According to Alexander Smith's 1719 book, A Complete History of the Lives and Robberies of the Most Notorious Highwaymen, such a dreadful spectacle made the man make the more obstinate resistance, as expecting the same fate if he fell into their hands. When King James found out, he sent in troops to find the cannibalistic clan. Then, when the men arrived at the cave, they found horrors beyond their comprehension. Body parts of adults and children were hung up like dried beef, with even more being pickled. From there, the family was taken into custody by the monarchy and executed for their crimes. That said, historians are not confident that Bean's family ever actually existed. So, despite The Hills Have Eyes being based on a true story, it may all just be an interesting legend passed down over time. Great inspiration, though.
I'll eat the heart of your stinking memory. I'll eat the brains of your kids!
Ahead of the 1977 film's original release, Craven spoke about the Bean family and how their execution mirrored their society. In an interview with Arrow, elaborating, "They did horrendous things to them. I just thought, what a great kind of A-B of culture. How the most civilized can be the most savage. I constructed these two families as mirrors of each other. I found it very interesting to look at ourselves, to think of ourselves as having the capacity not only for great good, but for great evil." Film writer John Woolley Wiley also discussed Craven's motives for modernizing the Bean family story in his 2011 book, Wes Craven, The Man and His Nightmares, writing, "Craven realized that by updating the Sawney Bean story to 20th century California, he would have the opportunity not only to comment on a cult society dwelling inside modern civilization, but also the chance to comment on that civilization's less than civilized retribution against the cannibals."
A black bear doing cocaine in the forest may sound like a fever dream or a joke with a bad punchline, but it actually happened, and Hollywood is actually making a movie about it. Elizabeth Banks, who played Effie Trinket in the Hunger Games trilogy and was the director of 2019's Charlie's Angels reboot, directs this black comedy. And Banks was very clear that Cocaine Bear is inspired by a true story, but not directly based on it. The real event that inspired the movie happened in 1985, when a drug runner flying a small plane dropped a whole lot of cocaine into a forest. It was then consumed by a black bear.
Beth, we should go.
Banks claimed Andrew C. Thornton was doing drug runs from Colombia. He dropped drugs out of an airplane, and he was a paratrooper in the Army in one of his many careers before he became a drug runner. Thornton and his flying partner dumped their packages of nose candy near Blairsville, Georgia, and parachuted out of the plane. Abandoning the scene in this way wasn't unusual practice for the runners, as Banks said. He would then jump out of the planes and, go home. Literally, jump into the backyard and go home, and crash the planes into the Atlantic Ocean often. However, Thornton got caught up in his parachute and ultimately died after falling from the plane outside Knoxville, Tennessee. The plane itself ended up in Hayesville, North Carolina. In the real event, according to Banks, searchers didn't find the drugs themselves, but they did find the black bear in Chattahoochee National Forest. Having consumed roughly 70 pounds of cocaine, it had died from an apparent overdose. But Cocaine Bear is not a straightforward tale of a bear who doesn't make it after eating a lot of drugs. This movie has a very different take on what actually happened and is structured as more of a what-if story. What if the hero of a movie was a giant, tuned-up bear out for revenge? When asked about how she came across this strange project, Banks referenced reading Jimmy Warden's script for the movie. She recounted, "He was on a text with Brian Duffield, who is also a writer and one of the producers of the movie. He basically read an article and he sent a text saying, 'Wouldn't this make a funny movie?' And Brian said, 'Write it.' And Jimmy wrote it and I read it, and then there it is."
A bear did cocaine!
Banks claimed that she had empathy for the bear, saying, "It is really upsetting because this bear is collateral damage from our truly f***ed up war on drugs, and I feel like we should make a movie that is the bear's revenge story." While it was once owned by country singer Waylon Jennings, the taxidermied 175-pound American black bear is currently on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky. The bear's name? Pablo Escobar. Give that a moment to sink in before you plan to visit. The idea of a coked-up, rampaging black bear getting revenge on the bad guys is one of the weirder things that have gotten the big screen treatment lately. But we're getting used to the weird stuff in 2022. A bunch of feral hogs destroyed $22,000 worth of cocaine stashed in a forest in Italy in 2019, so it's not the only time something like this has happened, and we can only hope that someone named one of the hogs Tony Hogtana.
Say hello to my little friend!
Horror flicks are designed to freak the pants off of filmgoers, but what happens when big screen scares turn out to be more than just monstrous movie magic? Truth is often scarier than fiction, and the real-life events that inspired Poltergeist are no exception. In Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist, 5-year-old Carol Ann, played by Heather O'Rourke, points at the television static and participates in an inexplicable conversation with the screen. Carol Ann repeats this ritual the next night and ominously declares,
"They're here."
This proclamation marks the beginning of the end for the Freelings, who are targeted and torn apart by the supernatural chaos that grips their home. The poltergeist activity that the Freelings endure ranges from benign to macabre, where things start off with misbehaving furniture and escalate to a sentient tree attempting to devour one or more family members. From the perspective of spirit lore, poltergeists are known to be raucous entities who enjoy messing with furniture or pulling off mischievous pranks to annoy homeowners. In Poltergeist, Hooper imbues these spirits with malicious intent, where they prey on pure life forces and ambush innocents when they least expect it. While Hooper's taut direction and Steven Spielberg's gripping story helped elevate Poltergeist into a genuinely unnerving tale about a haunting, the true story that inspired the film feels even more surreal when one considers the account of Lucille Herman, who had to contend with some severe poltergeist activity in her home in 1958. Speaking to HuffPost, Herman recounted her personal experience with poltergeists, which the 1982 film allegedly loosely drew from to cement its premise. She went into considerable detail about the haunting in the 2012 TV documentary Real Fear: The Truth Behind the Movies.
It's quite a heavy piece of furniture. This made the loudest crash. I thought the whole house caved in.
The documentary highlighted real-life paranormal experiences that inspired massive horror franchises like Silent Hill and Amityville Horror, and Herman happened to be one of many who contributed. Her story of what she believed was a real-life haunting only contributes to what makes Poltergeist so viscerally frightening. Herman kicked off the interview by stating that she had never seen the 1982 film as she had her own nightmare to deal with over the years. Recounting the events of February 3, 1958, Herman explained how her family had heard popping sounds in the house.
You'd hear this very strange, loud noise, like a popping bottle sound, and then you would eventually find a bottle that was maybe 12 feet away.
As this event seemed harmless, the family decided to stay calm and tried to figure out whether this was a prank by teenagers who lived nearby. However, the next day, bottles moved inexplicably through the air, and even after the police were called, these popping sounds increased in intensity. Scientific reasons, such as electronic disturbances and the like, were allegedly ruled out, and a priest was brought in to bless the home soon after. An article in Life magazine popularized the news of the haunting, attracting attention from conspiracy theorists and paranormal experts who wrote letters to the Hermans and offered their take on what might have been occurring. A parapsychologist approached them and deduced that the hauntings might have something to do with the presence of their children, who are believed to attract such entities, and the activities ceased after the hauntings were studied and recorded by this expert and his colleagues. While there are no clear answers about what happened, the Herman incident allowed the word poltergeist to bask under a spotlight that was both unnerving and intriguing at the same time. While Herman's personal experience is creepy, the events that plagued the cast and crew of Poltergeist are decidedly unnerving for various reasons. Plenty of written investigations have been conducted about the apparent curse that plagued the filming process. Whether these speculations are true boils down to one's belief in the supernatural. Regardless of personal beliefs though, over 40 years later, Poltergeist still manages to feel frightening enough, even without the chilling real-life context. However, Herman's tale adds to the unsettling feeling of being watched in one's own home and jolted out of one's comfort zone in a way that evades explanation.
Directed by Brian Bertino, The Strangers is a lean and mean slab of horror about three masked strangers who terrorized an estranged couple simply because they happen to be at home. The group determines that the couple is around when one of the members knocks on their door.
Hi.
Hello.
Is Tamara here?
That's all the invitation these invaders need to begin their horrific game of cat and mouse. Chillingly, this actually happened to Bertino when he was a child. Someone knocked on his front door asking for someone who didn't live there. Bertino later learned there was a series of break-ins in his neighborhood around the same time. The robbers would target houses where no one answered the door. He has also said that the film was inspired by the Manson family killings. While Bertino has never corroborated this theory, many viewers also speculate that the film is based on the Ketty murders, an unsolved homicide in which a family of three and a friend were brutally stabbed and beaten to death in their cabin in Ketty, California. Stuart Rosenberg's 1979 film, The Amityville Horror, is based on the 28-day haunting of the Lutz family. In both real life and the film, the previous owners of the Lutz's new home were killed in their beds by their son, Ronald DeFeo, 2 years before the Lutz clan moved in. When Kathy Lutz brought in a priest to bless the home, he heard a voice loudly tell them to leave. Things soon became progressively worse for the family. They smelled foul odors and observed other bizarre activities, and the Lutz family claims the actual events that took place were too horrifying to even discuss. The infamous Ed and Lorraine Warren were even involved in the investigation, refuting claims that the whole thing was fake. The Amityville Horror is still thought to be a hoax due to a lack of evidence, as well as George Lutz's supposed involvement with the occult. Regardless of what is true, it's one scary concept. The film did take some liberties, however, such as having George become completely possessed and pushing him to the brink of committing murders similar to DeFeo's. Ed and Lorraine Warren are known as the con men of the paranormal world, exploiting the desperate for fame and recognition. But in James Wan's The Conjuring franchise, the Warrens became ghost-hunting Catholic superheroes. The second film about the Warrens, The Conjuring 2, is based on the case of the Enfield Poltergeist, which tormented a single mother named Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children in their North London home. For 18 months, Hodgson and her family claimed that they saw furniture moving by itself, heard knocks and disembodied voices, and actually levitated. The youngest daughter, Janet, allegedly became possessed by the poltergeist, who spoke through her and told investigators he was the ghost of Bill Wilkins, who had previously died in the house. It wasn't just the Hodgsons who had a brush with the paranormal either. Over 30 people, including journalists, neighbors, and other investigators, witnessed some sort of activity there. However, the Warrens were not as involved in the case as The Conjuring 2 would lead you to believe. In fact, they showed up to the house unannounced and were initially not allowed inside. Regardless, regarding the case, the real-life Ed Warren said, "Those who deal with the supernatural day in and day out know the phenomena are there. There's no doubt about it." Of course, subsequent investigations have suggested Janet and her sister were almost certainly lying about the poltergeist, but it still makes for a pretty good story.
How does it feel to be haunted by a poltergeist?
It's not haunted. Shut up.
Borderland is based on the horrific murders overseen by Adolfo Costanzo, a practitioner of Palo Mayombe, who led a cult he called the Narco-Satanists. In his own twisted practice of Palo Mayombe, an established African religion, Costanzo committed human sacrifice to feed a special cauldron that he believed protected his group from harm or capture. This is because, in addition to cultists, they were also prolific drug traffickers. In total, Costanzo was responsible for 15 confirmed deaths, although it is thought that the number could be much higher. Borderland tells a fictionalized story following actual victim Mark Kilroy, an American student who was kidnapped, tortured, and ritualistically killed to protect the narco-Satanists from being apprehended by the police. It also closely follows the rituals and practices of Palo Mayombe, choosing to explain the religion rather than removing it to make the film more palatable for a wider audience. In fact, the inclusion of Palo Mayombe in Borderland makes the film all the more terrifying, as the viewers realize that these are actual traditions that have been practiced in the real world. Ty West's 2013 found footage film The Sacrament is based on the Jonestown Massacre of 1978, committed by the People's Temple's cult leader Jim Jones at the religion's compound in Guyana. The compound was where Jones fled from the police investigation into his cult, which was being exposed for questionable practices from ex-members. Jonestown, the inspiration for Eden Parish in The Sacrament, was supposed to be a socialist utopia, but actually acted as a front for Jones's mistreatment of his followers. After being investigated by U.S. Representative Leo Ryan, a group of defectors asked for help leaving Jonestown. Chaos broke out, and acolytes shot at Ryan's plane to prevent the ex-cultists from returning to the United States. There are no politicians in The Sacrament, but a camera crew does help defectors with their helicopter, which also leads to a shootout. Amidst the shooting, the real Jones forced his parishioners to drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. In total, 918 people died in Jonestown. Through the found footage format, The Sacrament adds a new perspective to the well-known story. This isn't a biopic, but a harrowing recreation of what it would be like to live through such an experience. Fire in the Sky is an alien abduction film based on the book The Walton Experience, which was written by Travis Walton, an actual alien abductee. Walton was a logger who, along with his coworkers, discovered a saucer-shaped flying object floating in the woods. He made the questionable decision to approach it and was subsequently brought inside the vessel via a bright beam of light. This was witnessed by his coworkers, who drove away in fear. While in the ship, Walton says he fought small, bald creatures until a human being calmed him down and placed a mask over his face, knocking him out. Walton woke up 5 days later on the side of a highway. Since Walton's memory of the abduction was very hazy, Fire in the Sky screenwriter Tracy Torme took a few artistic liberties to craft an effective horror movie. The prime example is the graphic depiction of Walton's time with the aliens, which includes being trapped on a table by a strange, suffocating membrane and suffering a probing that goes through his eye.
I said, don't you blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative!
Yes, Wes Craven's meta-horror masterpiece Scream is, in fact, based on a true story. Specifically, Scream writer Kevin Williamson was inspired by the Gainesville Ripper, aka Danny Rolling, who killed a total of 8 people in 1990. The Gainesville Ripper first gained notoriety when he broke into several apartments and stabbed 5 students. Rolling's killings were not only violent, though. He also posed the bodies in sexually suggestive positions and carefully staged the crime scenes to create a sense of repulsion in those who found them. He was later charged with a further 3 homicides. One of Rolling's most shocking actions occurred when he realized that he left his wallet at a crime scene. He went back to retrieve it and decided while he was there to decapitate one of his victims and place her head on a shelf. While Rolling's specific crimes don't occur in Scream, Williamson was inspired by this student-focused killing spree to write a story about a killer who taunts young women over the phone. The first Conjuring film centers on a family of 7 who move to a farmhouse full of demons and spirits who torment the family. The story is based on the Perron haunting, which was one of the Warrens' most prominent cases. The Perrons moved into a 14-room farmhouse in 1971 and immediately began experiencing strange phenomena, which started with missing items and escalated to full-on possession. The film is rather true to the real-life events, including the name of the spirit, Bathsheba, who was an actual person who supposedly lived on the property in the mid-1800s. However, Ed Warren did not perform the climactic exorcism in the film. Instead, he conducted a seance, as he did not have permission to perform a sacred rite. William Friedkin's 1973 horror classic, The Exorcist, is often cited as one of the scariest movies of all time. What makes it even scarier is that it's based on the actual exorcism of Roland Doe in 1949. Roland Doe is not the boy's real name, but the one used to protect his family's privacy. While Roland became Reagan for the film, Friedkin said that most of the film's events were actually observed by Doe's family during the possession, as verified by those involved. He also consulted the journals of the priests who performed Doe's exorcism to ensure that he got the details right. Strange things started happening to Doe's family after the death of his aunt Harriet, with whom Doe was very close. As an only child, Doe clung to Harriet, who introduced him to Ouija boards and spiritualism.
You really don't want me to play, huh? No, I do. Captain Howdy said no.
After her passing, objects would levitate and fly across the room when Doe was nearby. As the possession got worse, a number of exorcisms were performed on Doe. One was halted after Doe ripped a box spring out of a mattress and sliced a priest's arm open. During the final exorcism, strange marks appeared on Doe's body. He broke a priest's nose, and his head reportedly spun around, although that detail was never corroborated. These days, Doe's case is thought to be a fake, merely a case of abuse against a mentally ill teenager. Tobe Hooper's debut film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is a classic horror film about a family of cannibals who prey on young tourists, with the infamous killer Leatherface wearing their skin. This horrifying premise is based on the story of Ed Gein, a killer and grave robber who exhumed the dead bodies of local women, cut off their skin, and wore it. Gein always stole bodies that resembled his mother, with whom he had a very fraught relationship. Hooper took Gein's disturbing actions and turned them into something even more upsetting, adding cannibalism, meat hooks, and chainsaws to the mix. Gein was only convicted of 2 killings, so he wasn't a serial killer per se. He was just a deeply disturbed murderer. His crimes didn't just inspire Hooper either. His story was also the basis for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and Jonathan Demme's The Silence of the Lambs. The Zodiac killer terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 60s, killing a confirmed 5 people, though he claimed in cryptic notes to have killed 37. Even more terrifying, he was never caught. David Fincher took that bone-chilling story and adapted it into the 2007 film Zodiac, which documents the lives of the men who became obsessed with trying to solve the case. All of the murders and attempted murders from the film are based on actual events, including the double killing of Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau, and the escape of pregnant Kathleen Johns and her baby daughter. Fincher also perfectly captures the obsession that plagued the men involved in tracking him down, as well as the fear that the Zodiac killer spread across the region. While many true crime fans know the ultimate outcome of the investigation, Fincher is still able to ramp up the tension. These men got so close to finding the killer, but ultimately failed, as they found little more than circumstantial evidence.
Can a space be haunted by memories of past lives? Here's one spot that not only begs the question, but also inspired one of A24's spookiest 2022 installments. When director Joanna Hogg embarked on her journey to find a location for her atmospheric, vaguely gothic ghost story, The Eternal Daughter, she was looking for a place that would give her the creeps. So, quite naturally, she began searching on the internet for haunted manors in the United Kingdom. She explained in an interview with RogerEbert.com, "I was Googling houses around the country, and it was very much about finding an image of a building that made me feel a little bit scared. So I looked at Scotland, I looked in Cornwall, I looked at the most haunted houses in the UK. Then I saw an image of Sawton Hall in North Wales, and it just looked frightening, but also very beautiful. Although Sawton Hall doesn't seem as though it's populated by any actual ghosts, it is haunted by something perhaps more poignantly in line with the narrative of this film: memories." The Eternal Daughter stars Tilda Swinton in dual lead roles, a filmmaker, Julia, and her elderly mother, Rosalind, who embark on a trip to a remote hotel that was once a private residence owned by their ancestors. Knowing that Rosalind has cherished childhood memories of the estate, Julia hopes to connect with her mother and write a screenplay about their relationship. But from the very beginning, this isolated hotel is, Well, strange. Julia and Rosalind appear to be the only guests in the entire place, cared for by the sole hotel employee on the premises, who is comically disinterested in her duties as hostess. Although they appear to be alone, Julia is kept up at night by loud noises from the unoccupied room above her and can't shake the feeling that the hotel is haunted by some unseen entity.
There was a sound, I'm sure other people have mentioned it to you.
Joanna Hogg's direction of The Eternal Daughter goes a long way in giving the film its sense of atmosphere, but the choice to film at the historic Sawton Hall turns it into a proper Gothic ghost story. Sawton Hall was built in Flintshire, Wales in the early 1700s and was completely overhauled nearly 100 years later. The architect for the building project was Sir Charles Barry, whose work may be familiar to period drama enthusiasts. Not only was he responsible for redesigning the Houses of Parliament after they were destroyed in a devastating 1834 fire, but he was also the mastermind behind Highclere Castle, the famous filming location of Downton Abbey. Sawton Hall was owned by the Banks family, prominent landed gentry based in Dorset, from the early 1800s all the way through the 1980s, when the house was finally sold off. Much like the hotel in The Eternal Daughter, Sawton Hall was transformed into an event venue where one could get married or, in the case of Joanna Hogg, quietly film an eerie ghost story in a sudden burst of pandemic-induced creativity. The 20th century history of Sawton Hall even more closely aligns with the events of The Eternal Daughter. In the film, Rosalind is reminded of her childhood memories at the manor house. She spent a great deal of time there under the care of her aunt, especially during World War II, when children were shipped away from the major cities to protect them from the nightly bombing raids. Each room for her holds complicated emotions, cherished days spent with friends and family, tinged with the unmistakable melancholy of a distinctly traumatic time. The youngest generations of the Banks family have similarly hazy memories of their time visiting Sawton Hall. In an interview with the BBC, Will Banks spoke of spending Christmas there as a young child, back when his great-grandparents still lived in it as a primary residence. Like Rosalind, very specific things stuck out in his memory, such as, quote, driving my grandmother's car down the long drive, sitting on her knee. The family and residents were hardly the only people who lived in Sawton Hall. And, as we see with the caretaker Bill, there's an endless series of servants, groundskeepers, and other members of staff who have a powerful connection to the property as well.
Memories flood back in this place.
Eve Taylor spoke to Welsh News Extra about her fond memories of growing up in the shadow of the mighty country house. Her family had been connected to the estate since the beginning of the 20th century, when her great-grandfather took a job at Sawton Hall, working as a gamekeeper. Each generation after was employed in some capacity by the Banks. As a child in the 1940s, Eve lived in an apartment above the estate stables, since her mother worked as a maid there. She reminisced, "There were still horse carriages in the garages when I was there as a child. They weren't used, and I remember looking at them and thinking they looked quite forlorn and a bit ghostly. I was very close to my grandparents. They were lovely people, and I loved living there. It was idyllic." These stories, along with the manor's 300-year history, paint a picture of a home teeming with memories. When we see Sawton Hall on screen in The Eternal Daughter, every room, hallway, and staircase feels heavy with ghosts of a different sort. Not supernatural in origin, but the feeling of every figure who ever lived there still occupying the space. This house mattered to them in 1,000 tiny ways, and it's as though they are kept alive, still roaming the halls, because of that emotional connection. It invokes the idea that lives spent in a place leave a mark on it. And if this is the case, then there surely is an element of reunion in visiting spaces that meant a great deal to our loved ones.